Good evening and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown Brief. I am your host Leela, bringing you the latest developments from India's debt and fixed income markets. Let's begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bond transactions. Unifin's Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 18.00% with a trade value of 15 lakh rupees. Another transaction from Unifin's Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 16.50% with a trade value of 0.30 lakh rupees. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.90% with a trade value of 100 lakh rupees. Regency FinCorp Limited recorded a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 10 lakh rupees. Another transaction from Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.40% with a trade value of 30 lakh rupees. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bond transactions. Bengal Shriram High-Tech City Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.44% with a trade value of 100 lakh rupees. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 4,246.67 lakh rupees. Navi Limited recorded a yield of 12.05% with a trade value of 200 lakh rupees. CR Capital Private Limited recorded a yield of 12.00% with a trade value of 40 lakh rupees. Another transaction from CR Capital Private Limited recorded a yield of 12.00% with a trade value of 150 lakh rupees. Now, let's look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 35,230.53 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 45,877.37 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 10,646.84 crore rupees. Net investment for June, month to date, stood at negative 62,748.780 crore rupees. Turning to foreign portfolio investor activity in the debt market. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at 1,725.78 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, gross purchases stood at 252.66 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, gross purchases stood at 3,213.46 crore rupees. Under the general limit category, gross sales stood at 482.49 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, gross sales stood at 118.62 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, gross sales stood at 855.56 crore rupees. Net investment under the general limit category stood at 1,243.29 crore rupees. Net investment under the voluntary retention route stood at 134.04 crore rupees. Net investment under the fully accessible route stood at 2,357.90 crore rupees. For June month to date, net investment under the general limit category stood at 3,844.80 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, month to date net investment stood at 3,223.09 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, month-to-date net investment stood at 15,627.33 crore rupees. For calendar year 2026, year-to-date net investment under the general limit category stood at 450 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, year-to-date net investment stood at 271 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, year-to-date net investment stood at 30,240 crore rupees. Moving to money market rates. The call rate stood at 5.29%. The tri-party repo rate stood at 5.27%. The basket repo rate stood at 5.29%. The special repo rate stood at 5.11%. Now, the India government bond yield curve. The 1-year yield stood at 5.93%. The 3-year yield stood at 6.20%. The 5-year yield stood at 6.46%. The 7-year yield stood at 6.72%. The 9-year yield stood at 6.87%. The 10-year yield stood at 6.87%. The 15-year yield stood at 7.19%. The 30-year yield stood at 7.53%. Moving to Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs, the 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.30%. The 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.55%. The 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.91%. Let's review liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 1,60,769 crore rupees. The standing deposit facility stood at 1,61,891 crore rupees. The marginal standing facility stood at 1,122 crore rupees. Now, the MIBOR OIS curve. The 1-year rate stood at 5.92%. The 2-year rate stood at 6.06%. The 3-year rate stood at 6.16%. The 5-year rate stood at 6.30%. Moving to modified MIFOR rates, the 2-year rate stood at 0.00%. The 3-year rate stood at 6.68%. The 4-year rate stood at 0.00%. The 5-year rate stood at 6.89%. Turning to the currency markets, the US dollar to Indian rupee exchange rate stood at 94 rupees and 69 paise compared to 95 rupees and 21 paise previously. The euro to Indian rupee exchange rate stood at 109 rupees and 97 paise compared to 110 rupees and 13 paise previously. The British pound to Indian rupee exchange rate stood at 127 rupees and 15 paise compared to 127 rupees and 65 paise previously. The Japanese yen to Indian rupee exchange rate stood at 59 paise, unchanged from the previous level. The Chinese yuan to Indian rupee exchange rate stood at 14 rupees compared to 14 rupees and 8 paise previously. Now, commodities and key market indices. Gold, 24 carat, 99.9% purity, stood at 15,153 rupees per 10 grams, compared to 14,908 rupees previously. Silver stood at 2,650 rupees per 10 grams, compared to 2,600 rupees previously. Crude oil stood at $83.08 per barrel, compared to $87.40 previously. The Sensex closed at 76,264.33, compared to 75,527.95 previously. The Nifty closed at 23,853.90 compared to 23,622.90 previously. Finally, let's review today's primary corporate bond issuances. Credit Axis Grameen Limited issued bonds worth 100 crore rupees with a tenure of 25 months. The issue is rated AA- by ICRA Limited. Muthoot Finance Limited issued bonds worth 2,100 crore rupees with a tenure of 61 months and a coupon of 8.65%. The issue is rated AA+ by CRISIL Ratings Limited and AA+ by ICRA Limited. Bajaj Housing Finance Limited issued bonds worth 2,000 crore rupees with a tenure of 60 months and a coupon of 8.25%. Bajaj Finance Limited issued bonds worth 2,500 crore rupees with a tenure of 60 months and a coupon of 8.00%. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited issued bonds worth 50 crore rupees with a tenure of 25 months and a coupon of 12.00%. The issue is rated BBB by India Rating and Research Private Limited. That concludes today's DebtCircle Sundown brief. Thank you for joining us. I am Leela. Stay informed, stay ahead, and have a wonderful evening.